For decades, the Basque people have quietly stood apart from every other population in Europe. They speak a language nobody has ever been able to trace to any other tongue on Earth. At first glance, that might seem like nothing more than an old regional curiosity. But modern DNA research has finally begun explaining why. It reveals a population that survived Rome, survived the Visigoths, survived centuries of Islamic rule, and emerged from all of it almost entirely unchanged. So who are the Basque? How did one people manage to resist forces that reshaped an entire continent again and again? Over the next few minutes, we'll trace that story back thousands of years through language, archaeology, and ancient DNA. But before we uncover what their DNA actually reveals, we first need to understand who the Basque are today, and how they managed to hold on to something so much of the rest of Europe simply could not. The Basque homeland stretches across the western edge of the Pyrenees, spanning both sides of the modern border between Spain and France. To the Basque people themselves, this land is known as Euskadi, or País Vasco, names that carry far more weight than a simple geographic label. Today, that homeland is organized into 7 historic provinces, 4 sitting on the Spanish side of the mountains, 3 on the French side, each one carrying its own distinct character, its own local traditions, while still belonging to the same larger cultural whole. At the very heart of that identity sits a language called Euskara. And here is the detail that makes the Basque genuinely unlike almost anywhere else in Europe. Euskara has no confirmed relative anywhere on the planet. Every other major language spoken across Western Europe today, Spanish, French, German, English, can ultimately be traced back through a documented family tree to a shared common ancestor somewhere in the deep past. Euskara simply cannot. It stands entirely alone. Today, roughly 250,000 people still speak Euskara fluently, and the overwhelming majority of them live on the Spanish side of the border rather than the French side. But even within that relatively small number of speakers, the language itself is far from uniform. Several distinct dialects exist across Basque country, and some of them differ from one another significantly enough that speakers from different valleys can genuinely struggle to understand each other without real effort. Think about what that level of internal variation actually suggests. A language this fractured into local dialects has likely been quietly developing in relative isolation for an extraordinarily long time, each valley and community shaping its own version slowly, undisturbed by any single outside force flattening it into uniformity. Basque country today has also become known for something considerably gentler than the centuries of conflict that shaped it. Its cuisine draws visitors from across the world. Its wine, built from ancient grape varieties like Tempranillo, carries its own long history. Traditional fishing villages and picturesque coastal cities now welcome tourism as one of the region's primary industries. And in many ways, that modern reputation has quietly replaced much of the harder history buried underneath it, the centuries of strife that once defined this same stretch of land. But do not mistake that modern, gentler reputation for the whole story. This is not simply an old European culture that happened, by pleasant coincidence, to survive into the present day. This is a people who resisted meaningful assimilation from nearly every direction across nearly 2,000 years of continuous outside pressure, and it is only within the last 2 decades that genetic science has even begun to seriously explain how that resistance was actually possible. Consider everything that swept across the rest of Europe during that same stretch of time. Empires rose and dissolved. Entire populations were absorbed, admixed, and reshaped by wave after wave of migration and conquest, again and again, across nearly every corner of the continent. The Basque, sitting in their mountain valleys and coastal towns, somehow avoided that same fate, remaining recognizably, stubbornly themselves through all of it. That raises an obvious question, one that historians and scientists alike have struggled to answer with any real confidence for generations. How exactly does a single people manage that kind of continuity when almost nobody else in Europe managed anything close to it? To even begin answering that question properly, you cannot simply start with the Romans or the Visigoths or any of the later conquerors who eventually failed to fully absorb the Basque into their own empires. You have to go back much further than that, to a time long before Rome existed at all, long before any of the modern borders that now divide Spain and France were ever drawn onto a map. You have to go back to the last ice age itself, to a moment when much of Europe sat buried beneath massive sheets of ice, and one small fertile corner of the continent became something genuinely rare, a place where life, against extraordinary odds, was actually able to continue. During the last glacial maximum, when massive ice sheets buried much of Europe and turned huge stretches of the continent into an uninhabitable wasteland, something genuinely different was happening along a narrow coastal band running from northern Spain into southwestern France. This region, known today as the Franco-Cantabrian Zone, functioned as a true refuge, a livable pocket where plants, animals, and people could continue to survive while the rest of Europe froze around them. Researchers consider this stretch of land one of the most densely populated glacial refugia anywhere on the entire continent, a narrow strip of habitable ground that effectively became a lifeboat for an entire ecosystem, humans very much included. While ice sheets locked down most of Europe in a grip that lasted thousands of years, this small corner of the map remained fertile enough, sheltered enough, to keep supporting life through the very worst of it. The earliest evidence of modern humans reaching the northern Iberian Peninsula dates back roughly 42,000 years. They arrived from further east, gradually spreading westward into this fertile, ice-free corridor, and archaeologists can trace their path with real confidence through the stone tools and early technology they left scattered behind them across the landscape. But here is where the story turns genuinely strange, and it is a detail that almost nobody outside the field has ever heard. Neanderthal populations are well documented living in the southern portion of the Iberian Peninsula during this exact same period, specifically south of a natural landmark known as the Ebro River. And despite modern humans having already arrived and settled in the north, there is no evidence at all, none whatsoever, of modern humans appearing south of that same river until 6,000 to 8,000 years after their initial arrival in the wider region. Sit with that gap for a moment, because it is genuinely enormous. 6,000 to 8,000 years is not a small, easily explained delay. It is a length of time longer than the entire span of recorded human history. For thousands upon thousands of years, one single river seems to have functioned as an actual boundary separating two different kinds of human being entirely. Modern humans holding the north, Neanderthals holding the south. Neither one crossing into the other's territory in any way that archaeology has yet been able to detect. Think about what that would have actually felt like, generation after generation, from the inside of that world. Imagine being born into a landscape where a broad, unremarkable river marked the edge of everything you knew and everything your family had ever known. And on the other side of that water lived an entirely different kind of person. Not a rival tribe speaking a different dialect of your own language, but a genuinely different species or subspecies of human altogether. And in the collective memory of your people, passed down through however many generations came before you, it had simply always been that way. There had always been another, sitting quietly just across the water, and that arrangement held firm for thousands of years without ever visibly breaking down. What kind of deep, territorial instinct does a divide like that carve into a people, held in place for that unimaginable length of time? Nobody can answer that question with any real certainty, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. All the evidence can genuinely say is that the boundary existed, and that it held for a truly extraordinary stretch of time before it eventually gave way entirely. Once that river boundary finally dissolved, and modern humans spread fully across the whole region at last, the story of who occupied this land did not simply settle into one smooth, unbroken population moving forward in a straight line from that point onward. Instead, an entirely new pattern of settlement began to take shape, one that would unfold across the region for thousands of years to come. Wave after wave of distinct cultures moving through the same Basque and Franco-Cantabrian landscape, each one leaving its own particular mark on this same stretch of ground, before eventually giving way to whatever came next. Once that ancient river boundary finally dissolved, wave after wave of distinct cultures began moving through the Basque and Franco-Cantabrian landscape over the millennia that followed. Each one is identified today primarily by the particular way its people shaped their stone tools, the small technological signatures scattered across archaeological sites that let researchers trace one culture giving way to the next across thousands of years. Some of these groups arrived from elsewhere, bringing entirely new techniques with them into the region. Archaeologists refer to these early cultures by names like the Mysterian and the Aurignacian, peoples who introduced their own particular ways of working stone into a landscape that had already been inhabited for tens of thousands of years by that point. But other cultures told a different story entirely. They seem to have actually originated within this specific region itself, the Solutrean and the Azilian among them, eventually spreading their own innovations back outward into the rest of Europe rather than simply receiving influence from somewhere else. Then came the Magdalenian culture, emerging roughly 17,000 years ago, a broadly nomadic people whose influence would eventually spread across nearly the entire European continent, according to a wide body of archaeological evidence gathered from sites scattered across the map. Layer after layer, culture after culture, each one leaving its own distinct mark on this same corner of the world, generation after generation, for thousands of years running. And yet, through every single one of those successive waves, something in this particular region kept quietly staying different from everywhere else being reshaped around it. A pattern that would only grow stranger the deeper researchers eventually dug into it. Decades later, once genetic science finally gave them the tools to actually test what the archaeology alone had only been able to suggest. Compared to much of the rest of Europe, agriculture and animal husbandry arrived in Basque country relatively late, taking real hold in earnest only around 8,000 years before the present. For a region that had already spent tens of thousands of years shaped almost entirely by hunting and gathering, the shift represented a genuine turning point, the slow beginning of a settled way of life built around herds and fields, rather than following migrating game across the open landscape. And the archaeological record actually shows exactly how that transition unfolded, one careful layer at a time. The very first domesticated animals to appear in burials from this period are, somewhat touchingly, companion dogs, animals kept close enough to their owners in life that they were buried alongside them in death. It is only in later excavations that the broader pattern of true animal husbandry becomes clear, with the remains of oxen, pigs, and early varieties of sheep and goats appearing across sites scattered throughout the wider region, confirming that farming and herding had become a genuine, sustained part of daily existence rather than a passing experiment quickly abandoned. Alongside this shift towards settled life came an entirely new kind of monument, one that still marks the landscape visibly today. Hundreds of dolmens and megaliths are scattered across Basque country, many of them deliberately positioned on hilltops and exposed ridgelines where they would have been visible from a considerable distance in every direction. Some of these structures are unmistakably burial sites, built specifically to hold and honor the dead. Others appear to carry a different kind of religious or ceremonial significance entirely, purposes that remain only partially understood even now, after generations of careful study. And still others seem to serve no funerary or spiritual function at all, functioning instead as storage or shelter, or in some cases as deliberate boundary markers, physical lines carved directly into stone, separating the territory claimed by one tribe from the land claimed by its neighbor just beyond it. This is the exact point where the story of Basque country stops being only about stone tools, ancient monuments, and buried bones, and starts becoming a story about identity itself. About a people slowly taking shape out of thousands of years of accumulated tradition on this same specific stretch of land. Because the descendants of the very communities leaving these graves in the ground would go on to become something that almost no other population in the whole of Europe managed to become across the millennia that followed. Somehow, against nearly every historical current running through the rest of the continent, they stayed remarkably, stubbornly unchanged. For a long time, that stubborn continuity was only a pattern historians and archaeologists could observe from the outside, visible in stone tools and burial customs, but genuinely difficult to prove at any deeper biological level. That began to change only recently, once ancient DNA technology finally advanced far enough to start testing what the archaeology alone could only ever suggest. The first major signal came in 2004, in a study published through Oxford Academic. Researchers were working to characterize the deep genetic history of European populations more broadly, and to do that properly, they needed a modern comparison point, a population whose genetics had changed as little as possible since the Neolithic period, something stable enough that older ancestral genetic signals could actually be measured against it with real confidence. The Basque population turned out to be one of the very few groups in all of Europe genuinely suited to that role, standing alongside only a small handful of other isolated populations from North Africa, Sardinia, and the Near East. In other words, geneticists were already quietly treating the Basque as a kind of living genetic time capsule, years before the fuller picture would ever come into proper focus. Then, in 2013, a mitochondrial DNA study examined female genetic lineages across the wider Franco-Cantabrian region specifically. The results were striking. Roughly 35% of those maternal lineages traced directly back to populations that predated the arrival of agriculture entirely, suggesting real, measurable genetic continuity stretching all the way back to the hunter-gatherer groups who had taken refuge in this exact region during the last ice age. This was not a population that had simply settled here recently and stayed put. Their own mothers' mothers' mothers, traced back far enough, led directly into the deep ice age past of this specific landscape. 2 years later, in 2015, a study examined ancient DNA recovered from 8 human skeletons found in the El Portalón cavern at Atapuerca in northern Spain. These were Neolithic farmers who had lived roughly 3,500 to 1,500 years before the Common Era, and their genetic profile turned out to be a distinctive blend, early farmer ancestry mixed together with the genes of local Stone Age hunter-gatherers. When researchers compared that specific genetic mixture against modern European populations, the closest match, by a clear margin, was the Basque population living today. That result did not simply confirm what everyone already assumed. It actually complicated the existing picture in a genuinely surprising way. It suggested a much closer connection between the Basque and the very first farmers to reach the region than anyone had previously thought likely. The researchers themselves were caught off guard by how similar early Iberian farmers looked to the modern Basque population, because it seemed to directly challenge the comfortable assumption that the Basque had simply existed unchanged since deep prehistory, untouched by any of the major agricultural transitions reshaping the rest of Europe around them. Think about what that finding actually does to the simpler version of the Basque story, the one where an isolated people simply sat quietly in their mountains for tens of thousands of years while the rest of the continent changed around them. That version turns out to be too neat, too simple to fully capture what the DNA was actually revealing. The Basque were not entirely untouched by the great transitions of European prehistory. They absorbed at least some of those changes directly into their own genetic history, blending early farmer ancestry with older hunter-gatherer roots in a way that still, somehow, produced one of the most genetically distinctive populations anywhere on the continent. That complexity was not a contradiction of Basque uniqueness. It was actually the first real clue toward understanding it properly. Because the deeper story was never going to be a simple tale of total, unbroken isolation from the very beginning of time. It was going to be something more layered than that, a population that absorbed real outside influence at certain specific moments in its deep history, while somehow still managing to remain genetically distinct from virtually everyone else around it. Understanding exactly how that combination was possible would take one more, considerably more detailed study, the kind of genetic survey nobody had ever actually been able to conduct properly until relatively recently. By 2017, a broader study extended that picture even further. Across much of Europe, later waves of migration from the Eurasian steppe had substantially reshaped local populations during the Bronze Age, introducing significant new genetic ancestry on a truly massive scale. But on the Iberian Peninsula specifically, and among Basque populations in particular, that same reshaping happened to a dramatically smaller degree. Genetically, these populations remained far closer to their Neolithic ancestors than almost anywhere else on the continent, a pattern the study's own authors noted explicitly stood in sharp contrast to what had happened further north across the rest of Europe. All of that earlier research finally converged in a much higher resolution study published in the journal Current Biology. This effort analyzed 190 genetic samples collected from across both the French and Spanish sides of Basque country, sequencing each one to characterize roughly 600,000 distinct genetic markers, by far the most detailed genetic survey of this population ever conducted by anyone, anywhere. The results confirmed what decades of smaller, more limited studies had already been circling around from different directions without ever quite proving it outright. The Basque are genuinely, measurably distinct from every neighboring European population, with an unusually fine-grained genetic structure that varies meaningfully from one individual village to the next across the region. This was not simply one broad population sharing a single genetic profile. It was a genuinely intricate mosaic, different in subtle, specific ways from town to town, each community carrying its own particular genetic fingerprint within the larger Basque identity. The study also revealed something important about the populations living at the very edges of Basque country itself. Communities researchers call the Basques. These groups occupy a fascinating middle position, their ancestry a genuine mixture of Basque and other Western European haplotypes, functioning almost like a buffer zone between the Basque core and the surrounding Spanish and French populations further out. Where the Basque themselves share genetic markers almost exclusively with other internal groups across the Franco-Cantabrian region, the Basques shared markers both internally and with outside populations beyond the region entirely, a genetic signature that reads almost like a gradient, growing steadily more distinct as you move deeper into the historic Basque heartland itself. And across the entire genetic record the study examined, researchers could identify only two significant windows where any substantial outside genetic mixing occurred at all. Both of those windows dated to sometime between the 11th and 16th centuries. Outside of those two narrow periods, the genetic record shows a population that had, for thousands of years, been left almost entirely to itself, largely undisturbed by the kind of steady outside influence that reshaped population after population across the rest of the European continent during that same enormous stretch of time. Think about what that genuinely means, laid out across the full sweep of European history. While empires rose and fell around them, while entire populations elsewhere were absorbed, admixed, and gradually reshaped by wave after wave of migration and conquest, the Basque experienced only two brief, specific windows of real outside genetic influence across literally thousands of years of continuous history. That is not a small statistical footnote. That is one of the most remarkable patterns of sustained genetic isolation documented anywhere on the entire continent. But that isolation itself raises an obvious, pressing question, one that DNA analysis alone can never fully answer on its own. Because genetics can tell you clearly what happened, the actual measurable outcome written directly into the population's own biology, it cannot, by itself, fully explain why it happened. Why did outside populations fail to mix into Basque communities the way they mixed into virtually every other population across Europe during that same enormous stretch of time? What actually kept that boundary in place, generation after generation, for literally thousands of years running, when almost no other population managed anything close to that same sustained separation? The answer to that deeper question may not be sitting in the DNA itself at all. It may be sitting instead in the one thing the Basque managed to preserve more completely than almost any other cultural inheritance passed down across all those centuries. The one detail that outlasted every single invasion, every attempted conquest, every outside empire that ever tried and ultimately failed to fully absorb this particular corner of Europe into itself. There is one detail about the Basque people that outlasts every dolmen, every burial layer, and every genetic study in this entire story, and it is something you can still hear spoken out loud today, in kitchens and classrooms and village squares across the region. Euskara, the Basque language, is what linguists call a true isolate, meaning it cannot be traced back to any other known language family on Earth. Every other major language spoken across Western Europe today, whether Spanish, French, German, or English, can ultimately be traced back through a documented family tree to a shared common ancestor somewhere in the deep past. Euskara simply cannot. It stands entirely alone, with no confirmed living relatives anywhere on the planet. And that gap has not stopped people from trying to explain it, repeatedly, for well over a century now. No linguist, working with any level of expertise, has ever been able to definitively link Euskara to any other language family, living or dead, anywhere in the world. What makes this linguistic isolation even more remarkable is not simply that it exists, but that it survived completely intact through an almost unbroken parade of powerful outside forces that reshaped nearly everything else around it. Roman rule swept across the entire Iberian Peninsula and imposed Latin as the dominant language virtually everywhere it went, and yet failed to displace Euskara from the Basque heartland. The Visigoths later claimed the region and attempted to hold it, placing armed wardens along its borders specifically because they could not fully conquer the people living inside them. Charlemagne himself launched a deliberate, concerted campaign beginning in the 760s, specifically intended to force the pagan Basque population to convert to Christianity, centuries after most of the rest of Europe had already done so voluntarily. And even that campaign appears to have met only partial success, since surviving accounts from the same general period still describe Basque communities on the frontier continuing to practice their older polytheistic traditions well afterward. That same campaign produced one of the most famous encounters in the entire history of Basque resistance. On Charlemagne's return march through the Pyrenees, his army was forced by the narrow mountain terrain to proceed in a long, exposed line, unable to move with any real flexibility through such thick, difficult forest. It was at exactly that vulnerable moment that Basque fighters set their ambush. They held a genuine tactical advantage in that specific skirmish, their lighter weapons and their deep familiarity with the terrain working directly against a Frankish force burdened by heavier arms and unfamiliar, uneven ground. Senior commanders fell in that fight, including Roland himself, one of Charlemagne's most celebrated warriors, and the attack scattered so completely afterward that the Franks had no real way of finding the men responsible in order to seek any kind of revenge. Centuries later, waves of Islamic rule swept across huge portions of the Iberian Peninsula to the south and held significant territory there for hundreds of years. And still, Euskara held its ground in the Basque heartland, untouched by Arabic in any lasting linguistic sense. Rome could not erase it. The Visigoths could not erase it. Charlemagne's armies could not fully erase it. Centuries of Islamic rule to the south could not erase it either. A language surviving that particular gauntlet of outside pressure, fully intact across more than 1,000 years of continuous attempts to reshape the people who spoke it, raises an obvious and pressing question that language alone was never going to be able to answer entirely on its own. But the most recent genetic research offers a genuinely compelling piece of that answer. It suggests the language itself may not simply be a symptom of Basque isolation. It may actually be one of the real mechanisms behind it. A living cultural barrier that made outside assimilation considerably harder to accomplish than it was almost anywhere else on the continent, protecting not just words and grammar, but the very genetic boundary the DNA studies had already revealed. Rome could not erase Euskara. The Visigoths could not erase it. Charlemagne's armies, even after winning battle after battle elsewhere across Europe, could not fully erase it either. And centuries later, an entirely different empire moving up from the south would run directly into that exact same wall, discovering that some things cannot be conquered simply by conquering the land underneath them. The DNA doesn't replace the Basque story. It adds another chapter to it. It shows roots reaching back to hunter-gatherers who survived the last ice age in one of Europe's last true refuges, and a language that outlasted Rome, the Visigoths, Charlemagne, and centuries of Islamic rule without ever being displaced. While the rest of Europe was reshaped again and again by migration and conquest, the Basque remained, largely, themselves. Their genetics are more than the sum of old admixture studies. They're a living record of resistance, carried forward through a language still spoken exactly the way it always confused every empire that tried to replace it. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and tell me in the comments which population we should uncover next.